Hi and welcome everybody. My name is Naomi Devine and I'll be introducing myself a little bit more formally to come. In the meantime, my colleague Kiana is going to talk to you about jumping into Mentimeter, which is a tool we'll be using today for an interactive experience for today's community conversation. So Kiana.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Naomi. So as Naomi mentioned, my name is Kiana. I'm a consultant with SSG, which I'll briefly talk about what that means later on. So we're using Mentimeter, which essentially is an online engagement tool. So what I do ask is you can either open another browser, or you can even use your phone. You can go directly to, well, there's two ways. You can either go directly to mentimeter.com and type in this code. The second way is to actually take a picture of this QR code, which when you take that photo, will automatically send you to the Menti itself. Or the third way as well is, as Naomi has shared in the chat, is just to click that link and automatically send you to Menti. So there's three ways to join. We ask that you set that up now because we'll be using this throughout the presentation. It'll also be a great way for us to hear your thoughts and your opinions as well.
Great, thanks very much, Kiana. So if you don't have the chat currently open, it can be found at the bottom of your Zoom panel bar. There's a little chat icon. Click on that, it'll open up and I've got the link there. Or as Kiana mentioned, there's other instructions on the screen. We'll take one more moment with that and then we'll officially start the meeting. If you do have trouble though, don't worry. At any time, we're happy to help you out. You can jump in the chat and let us know and we'll help troubleshoot to make sure that you can come along with us on the Mentimeter journey. Great. And so with that, Eben, I'll turn it over to you. And let's go to the next slide.
Okay. Thank you, Naomi. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eben Polk, and I'm with Clackamas County. I am the Sustainability and Solid Waste Program Manager, and we are one of the several programs that is involved in developing a climate action plan for our community. I want to just introduce briefly a couple of other staff on our team who are listening in on the conversation today from the county's side. Ellen Roglin with Public and Government Affairs is here, and Sarah Allison, who's a member of my team, is also with us. Also want to just draw your attention to the land acknowledgement on your screen, which we won't be taking time to read today, but we felt it was important to include. So today's conversation is around the Board of County Commissioners' priority and goal to adopt a climate action plan with specific actions that will get us to carbon neutral by 2050. And that is the sort of orientation of the conversation today. So again, welcome from the county. We're glad you're here. And we hope you enjoy and get a lot out of this conversation today. And with that, I would like to pass it back to the staff at SSG.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Eben. Well, all right, so I'll take us through today's agenda. So we're at the welcome and introduction sort of portion of the meeting, and we're going to go into Mentimeter. So stand by for that quickly to hear from you. We'll do a project overview with you today to let you know exactly where we are in the project, what phases we're in, and what phases are to come. We have a bit of a climate action game as well in Mentimeter that we hope is a bit of fun for you as well. We're going to cover climate action or climate planning 101 and Clackamas County's greenhouse gas inventory. We'll share that information with you. Clackamas County's business as planned future, and we'll talk about what business as planned means. We have a bit of a facilitated discussion, so that's where Mentimeter is going to come into play again. And then we'll wrap up with talking about the next steps in the project. If at any time you have questions, you can throw the questions into the chat as well, and we'll come to them as they come up, and we'll also, if we don't get to them in the presentation, we'll come to them at the facilitated discussion time as well. Next slide, please. All right, so let's do more welcome and introductions and find out more about who's in the room. I can start with the consulting team at SSG. So I'm Naomi Devine. I'm a senior consultant and member owner of SSG, and I've been doing climate action planning for unbelievable 17 years now, and I'm the lead of engagement at SSG, and I'm really pleased to be with you today and part of this project. And I'd like to have Brittany introduce herself.
Hi everyone, thanks for having us today. My name is Brittany Mclean. I'm also a senior consultant with SSG. I'm also the lead analyst on the Clackamas County Climate Action Plan. So I've been working very closely with Clackamas County staff to develop this plan and bring it to this point. And we look forward to learning more from you so we can move this even further. Kiana, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Kiana. I'm also a consultant at SSG, and I mostly do work around engagement.
Wonderful. Okay. And so Kiana, I think it's over to you, hey, for the introduction sort of Mentimeter, if you want to take everyone through that.
For sure. So for those who recently just joined, I see there's a few new people who hopped in last minute. We ask that you do join Menti. So again, that means you can use your phone or open a new browser. If you click that link in the Zoom chat, that will automatically take you to Menti. It will just ask you to type your name for us to get to know you. So introduce yourself by sharing your name, role, department or unit, or any organization that you're representing, or anything about yourself.
Welcome, Brett and Sam. Who else is with us today?
And if you're not affiliated with an organization or business today that you want to disclose, that's okay. We're happy to just know your name and know you're with us.
So I see that 2 people have answered.
Great, welcome Jamie and Sean, Anata.
Yeah, if
Hi.
you are, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, we got a couple introductions in the chat as well. So Rick and Sonia and Becky, welcome.
And I was just going to say, if there's any issues with logging into or getting to Menti, please let us know.
Yeah, we want to make sure that you're in here too for the facilitated discussion that's going to come in that portion of the meeting as well. Welcome Cheryl and Bill and Allie and Tom. Hi, Aaron. Glad you could all be with us today. We'll take about another 30 seconds here. Is anyone not able to get into Mentimeter? If you can let us know in the chat, that'd be great. Hey, Chuck, welcome. Hi, William. And for those of you using the chat, can you let me know if you can't get into Mentimeter? Okay, thanks, Becky. Welcome to using Zoom. That's great. Let us know if you need any further assistance. I will also throw the link to Mentimeter. It takes you directly to this presentation so that you can participate. I'm going to put it in the chat again for you as well. So if you just click on that in your browser and have that handy with you, you'll be able to participate in everything that we've got planned for you today. All right, let's go to the next slide. Thanks everybody for that. Okay, so a quick question here for everybody. We just want to find out your preferences. Do you prefer cake or do you prefer pie? Apologies to those who prefer a third type of dessert. There we go. So now you can see Mentimeter's sort of live polling sort of function, so we can start to see answers as you put them into the tool itself. Welcome, Gerald. Glad to have you here. Oh, pie is like totally pulling ahead here. My cake-loving heart is being broken as we speak. I'm not voting, by the way, too, so I'm not skewing the results. All right. Oh, cake is coming back. We'll take a few more seconds with this one and we'll move on to the next question. All right. And I think Ellen, you had said I think your preference was for pie too, so there we go. lots of pie friends with you today. Oh, and cake coming close. All right, let's go to the next question. Thanks everybody for that. All right, so our proposed operating values, these are sort of tried and true things that we have found over the years that work really well for having facilitated discussions like this or community conversations like today's session. So we want to make sure that we show respect for each other by using respectful language, sharing information, and listening to each other's perspectives. We want to ask that everyone ask questions in the chat during the presentations, and that way we can sort of come to them. Either we can answer them in the chat live, or we'll come to them when we have sort of a Q&A sort of portion of the meeting. And then we want to balance airtime to hear from as many voices as possible. We want to make sure that happens in today's session, and to be curious and challenge our own assumptions, essentially, and biases, because everyone's got an interesting point of view for us to share and consider together as a group. And we want to be open to building on each other's suggestions. And of course, you don't have to. You can also take things in another direction if you choose. So those are the proposed operating values. Is there any additional one that anyone wants to propose? Feel free to throw that in the chat if you've got one. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Thank you very much, everybody. So today's session objectives is to consult on implementation options to move forward with climate action in Clackamas County, and to involve all interested parties and community members in understanding your community values, aspirations, and the climate readiness for the forthcoming climate action plan itself. So these are the objectives that today's session have been built around. Let's go to the next slide. And over to you, Brittany. I think you're going to talk a little bit more about SSG.
Great, yeah. So we mentioned myself, Naomi, and Kiana are all consultants with Sustainability Solutions Group. So we've been around for almost 20 years now, and we've worked on over 100 climate action plans. We take a very holistic approach to climate action planning, and that comes from the diversity of our staff. We have project managers, process designers, facilitators, modeling experts, analysts, engineers, graphic designers, data visualizers, planners, and a whole lot more. So we bring all of that knowledge together, and we all function together, work together to create the most holistic and best climate action plans that we can. We're based out of, myself, Naomi, and Kiana are based out of different parts in Canada. We recently expanded our offerings and our staff into the United States and Chile as well. Our contribution, like I mentioned, we really have redefined climate action planning as whole city planning. Back in the day when climate action plans were new and community energy and emissions plans were new, we really were looking at things like the impact of land use on greenhouse gas emissions. And so we've really been in this innovative space over our past 2 decades together. We demonstrate the magnitude of the effort required. So we do use a modeling process, which I'll talk more about in a moment, but we really like to identify individually and uniquely for each community how much effort is going to be required by your particular community and what that looks like over time and through space, through the area in your community. We also demonstrate that the effort is worth doing, it's compelling. So in our work, we talk a lot about the financial impacts, both the costs and the financial return to taking action, and also the co-benefits. So in our plans, we investigate things like air quality, equity, etc. And we include those most affected by the outcome at every step. So Naomi and Kiana are part of our wonderful engagement team. They are certified engagement practitioners, and they work really closely to help communities develop the best engagement plans possible in order to involve community members and affected parties when we carry out these plans. So we're really lucky to have them on our team. Okay, I'm going to jump right into the process, and I'm going to tell you about what is the Clackamas County Climate Action Plan. So that's where we're going to start today. And like Naomi mentioned, you're going to hear me talk for quite a bit on and off here. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to stop at different points, and myself, Kiana, and Naomi will be available to answer questions. There may be questions that you ask us today that are very technical or have to do with our modeling, and that's okay. Because we have lots of data, we may have to take those questions away and get back to you. So if we don't answer your question while we're in this session, we will get back to you. So sort of our guiding star here in Clackamas County is that the Climate Action Plan for the community and internal county operations will identify opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase climate resilience, and identify sequestration opportunities. And the overarching goal that was behind this plan is to be carbon neutral by 2050. So that's really our guiding star and starting place for working with the county and working with community members as we develop a pathway. The process looks like this. So we've been spending time with Clackamas County. We're just moving on from phase 2 to phase 3. We've gathered data, we've developed models. I'm going to talk about those all in a moment. We've done a lot of looking at, what needs to be a part of this? What is the scope of the work? What do energy and emissions look like in the community right now? What could they look like in the future? If we continue with the policies and practices that are currently in place, and what more do we need to do? What's the size of the challenge to get to that carbon neutral target that the Board of Commissioners set? And so we've been working through those pieces, and there's more to come, of course, lots of iterations and opportunities for stakeholders, community members to look at that pathway and how we really implement on a climate action plan in Clackamas. All those pieces are upcoming. So I'll get into more of those details in a moment. But right now, we want to take a segue over to Kiana again. We want to have a little bit of fun, I hope, and play a climate planning game to help us understand how much you know about climate change, just to get a gauge of our audience. And we're interested to know sort of your perspectives on climate change right now. There's no judgment in this. It's just meant to be a fun game. So Kiana, I'm going to kick it back over to you.
Yep. Thank you, Brittany. So for those, I know some of us are having trouble going into Menti. And Thomas, I'm not to call you out, but also just this is exactly, I was going to actually text you right now. For those who are not able to get into that link, if you could actually just go into type in www.menti.com. When you go there, it should be a blank page with a text box that says enter code. And then that's where you enter the code 4652-2180. I can also type into the chat exactly as well.
Thanks, Kiana. As you can see, for those of you answering, you'll see the size of the circles change depending on how many people selected an answer. So we've got 3, I think we've got 12 potential responses.
So the main purpose of logging into Menti is this will be one of the main tools that we use for collecting all your thoughts and feedbacks, or your feedback around the questions I'll be asking today.
Yeah, that's how we're doing some interactive engagement today. If it ends up that you can't get in, though, Thomas, we'll take your feedback in the chat though as well.
Right. It sounds like we're so far 14 people in, maybe that everybody does feel like there's something that we can do about climate change,
which is great to see.
Yeah. So at this point, I'm gonna skip us ahead to the next slide. Kiana. I guess Kiana's helping people in the chat. So there are various actions, of course, we can do to address climate change and its impacts at different levels. Just like we're doing today. So it's really important, this engagement piece, to have conversations. Every community we work in is unique. So we know with climate action, there are some big sectors we need to address. We need to address transportation. We need to address the emissions that come from buildings. But how we address those in each community is unique, and it has to do with how is your community laid out? What actions are currently being taken? What sort of legislative authority do different governments have? What is the local culture like? Who do residents trust? And how do we get them engaged in climate action? So that is very unique to each community. We're going to move on to the next question here. What is a climate emergency?
So our options are: 1 is when you address further on climate. Second option is when governments declare climate change is more severe than initially anticipated. And lastly, when emergency personnel declare a heat wave is more severe than initially anticipated. So those options should be popping up for you, and you can choose and select which one you believe is correct or not, or which one's the right answer, essentially. Yeah. And we'll give a few more seconds for this question. Right, about 10 more seconds. All right, Brittany, you can go to the next slide.
Great.
All right, so most of us got the right answer. Essentially, climate emergency is when municipalities or different bodies of government do declare that climate change is actually more severe than initially anticipated. And currently within North America, over 600 plus municipal, provincial, territorial, as well as federal governments have actually declared a climate emergency. Next slide, please. Okay, so this one is another question. How much do you think, based on these three options, climate inaction will cost globally? Or how much global climate inaction will cost? So we see a few dots at the $178 trillion, or quite a few dots. Majority of the dots are at the trillions.
It's unanimous.
I know.
You're not fooling people with your questions, Canna.
No.
All right, let's take a look at the answer.
Yep. So you're right. Yes, actually, it's $178 trillion is how much climate inaction will cost us globally. So basically, that's another way of saying that climate action really is has a better return on investment than inaction. There's an article here. It's actually in Menti. There should be a link where you can actually, if you want to read more about how that number came about, that there was a study that was done looking at what that cost would be. What does that mean over the next, say, 10, 15, 20 years? And honestly, it's just about taking action now to prepare for the future. So this is another question, is it true or false? There is no point in doing anything if China isn't.
All right, so far looking unanimous on this one as well. It looks like everybody feels that there is a point in doing something, even if China is not. So let's take a look at the answer.
All right, so the answer is false. So again, in terms of net emissions, yes, China is one of the largest emitters of GHGs, or greenhouse gas emissions. That being said, they actually are also the largest investor in renewable energy. But also is also something to keep in mind when we're thinking about in China being the largest emitter. A lot of the things that we consume every day, the things that we wear, the things that we use are actually also manufactured in China, which is encompassed underneath their calculation of GHGs. So again, also, and lastly, again, it's not about shifting blame. We're all in this together, but and it might, as much as cringy that may sound, essentially that's what it is. And there's no point of trying to point fingers, because it's not going to help us at the end. Next slide. So this one is a slidey question. How much will unchecked climate change cost the US economy by 2070 in trillions? This is a trillions, of course. but you can slide and guess based on what you think that number will be.
We saw the global number already,
Yep.
so this is US specific.
Yep. I think most of us are that 13 to 15 range. Chunk is mostly at that 15. I think that's 13-ish. We're doing some estimations.
All right, should we see the results?
Yep. Oh. All right, so most of us also were towards the larger end of the spectrum, and you're pretty close. You're pretty right, actually. So the number is $14.5 trillion that US would actually experience an economic loss, and as well as in GDP, which would be 1.5 trillion in terms due to climate change. All right, so this one is a multiple choice question. Which action is better at reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And the options are recycling, local ban on plastic bags and bottles, retrofits. So there's electric retrofits as well as low emission standards for new buildings. So just which one is the best or better for within these four at reducing GHGs?
And just for clarification, EE does stand for energy efficiency retrofits. All right, we have a tie.
Yeah, and when we mean retrofit, we mean so your existing buildings, the buildings that already have been built. Ooh.
All right, energy efficiency retrofits and buildings pulling ahead. It's a 9 for that answer and 6 for low emission standards for new buildings, and then 1 for a local ban on plastic bags and bottles, and none for recycling. So let's see what the answer is.
So EE retrofits or deep retrofits would be the answer. So again, those can result in energy savings of more than 50%. So that really means more looking at retrofitting the things that like our walls or our windows, or as well as fuel switching. i.e. for example, heat pumps to improve energy efficiency in our homes and buildings. So there's another question, so agree or disagree. So to make housing affordable, we have to forego making them energy efficient.
All right, strong disagreement coming out of the gate early. It's great, this is an informed group.
All right, let's switch over to our answer here.
And majority of us, or probably all of us, actually got it right. So housing essentially is also a climate change issue. It's not one or the other. So we ensure that any building that's being done or housing that's being built today will help and be there around for the future, particularly underneath the impacts of climate change. And of course, it might be for what is affordable today does not mean it'll be affordable tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Energy efficiency certainly lowers utility costs, even if it costs more upfront to build. So
sure.
there's a tension there.
Yep.
All right, next one.
So weather is a deterrent to active transportation uptake. So basically, that's another way of saying people don't want to use active transportation. So riding your bike, using a skateboard, walking, basically anything that doesn't require a car or a truck. Weather is a deterrent from doing those activities. Okay, so this one is one of the few questions that we're seeing. There's not like an automatic majority. Well, there is, but you're seeing a bit of there's a little bit of true and false here for some things that people are saying.
All right, let's go over and see the answer.
So actually it's false. So there was a research that was done by a Canadian organization called the Clean Air Partnership, where they actually were trying to figure out if this is true or not. And they actually found that it isn't. What actually deterred a lot of people from doing active transportation was more of things around infrastructure, how long that trip would be, as well as the ability to switch modes. So the ability to go from a bus to a bike or from a bike to a bus. And it just really is that, again, is that infrastructure available? Is it usable? Is it accessible?
I was this was interesting when we were looking at different questions. This was an interesting finding to me as well.
And that's the last. And thank you for playing that climate action game.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. I hope that you had some fun with that. And we're going to move on now to another part of the presentation, and then there will be an opportunity for some discussion questions at the end. And so we will be using Mentimeter again. But for now, I'm going to move on to the next piece of the presentation, and please put any questions that you have in the chat while I'm speaking. Okay, so this next section is Climate Planning 101. So I'm going to talk to you about how we plan for climate change. And this is somewhat particular to SSG's model for climate action planning. So our guiding principles are really clear pathway of actions over time. So as I mentioned, we use a modeling process. We make sure that everything is time-bound and spatial. So we know we have a good sense of changes over time in space. We align with federal, state, and international requirements. So we ensure that we're taking those into account when we're determining what the future is likely to look like without additional action. And then when we are building in additional actions to reach a target, we make sure that they're aligned as well as they can be, so that we're not duplicating efforts, or we're not veering off in a totally different direction unless there is some, great need for change in a certain sector. We use metrics to monitor, adjust, and justify investment. And so when we finish this plan with Clackamas County, we will be providing both metrics and guidance for adaptive management. Plans are great, but in reality, plans don't always go as planned. And so we want our clients to walk away and be able to be as successful as possible, and to be able to work with you, the community members, and to receive feedback and to adjust the plan in an ongoing way. Our other principles are an equitable transition to sustainability. There are real concerns around equity. Who pays? How do we deliver programs? How do you reach people? And so we try to start those conversations in the climate action planning process. Again, those are pieces where we learn, we start to dig in, we develop those initial actions, and then it's up to your community to continue those conversations and those engagements in the long run in implementation. And we strive to maximize co-benefits and minimize co-harms. So an example of this is maximizing co-benefits, a transition to zero emission vehicles, reducing air quality issues, and increasing positive outcomes for people with health issues, chronic health issues. Minimizing harm would mean if there are jobs lost in this transition, that we're recommending things like employment bridging programs to get people into new industries that will be up and coming with the transition to a low carbon economy. So we work in all those factors. We know we rely on best practices from other jurisdictions, previous work we've done, and also consultation with the county and with the community to understand some of the goals, aspirations, concerns, fears around those co-benefits and harms that exist in a community. Our process is really an iterative one. So there's a very technical piece to this. So as I mentioned, I'm going to get a little bit more into the modeling piece, but we need to understand the baseline. What does energy use look like in your community right now? Where are the emissions coming from? What actions, what physical changes on the ground are going to decrease those emissions? How much is it reasonable to do? How fast? and how do we sequence those actions to maximize benefits? So I'll give you an example. We could put a whole bunch of solar in right now. It would be very expensive. It would work if we put enough solar in, but it's actually more cost effective sometimes, and it makes more sense to first retrofit buildings so everybody has good windows, good doors, good insulation, a nice cozy place to live, and then you're putting on less solar panels. So you're making the investments in different places. You'd want to do those retrofits first before you put the solar on to make sure you're not over purchasing on solar. And then we do the engagement side as well. So as I've mentioned throughout, we look at local opportunities, local constraints and challenges. We do desktop reviews of policies and practices. We do engagement opportunities. We try to understand the support needed and wanted in the community to be able to take climate action. We're going to talk about some of that later today, and the co-benefits again. And so these processes really feed into each other. So if we hear from, we can model just about anything. We have very talented modelers, but we want it to be realistic for your community. So if we are telling everybody, you need to put solar on your roof and you need to do, this and that, and you're saying, that doesn't work for our community for X, Y, and Z reasons, we're not going to plow through and continue to say, this is what you need to do. We're going to try to work to find a different solution. At the end of the day, carbon neutral is carbon neutral. It means all the emissions need to go away. And so everything does need to be done, but there is some flexibility there in how it gets done, who pays, who takes the lead, those pieces. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about our technical modeling. So I've mentioned this a little bit. There are 4 phases to our modeling. We do baseline modeling. So that answers the question of how is energy being used throughout the community today and what are the sources of emissions from that energy use. The baseline year for Clackamas is 2018 because of the data that we have available to us. It's some of the best data from the census and things, and also just catching up with data availability. Then we go on to business as planned modeling. So at this stage, we're looking and saying, how will energy be used in the future? And what are the sources of emissions expected to be between the baseline, which is 2018 in this case, and the target date, which is 2050 in this case. And that is based on an understanding of, again, the policies and practices that are in place. And that's not just at the county level, it's at the state level, it's at the federal level. So we take all of that into account. And we say, it's not that there's nothing happening. There's all of these different factors happening at once. We take those into account. We also take into things like population growth. So sometimes you will see really great policies in a community that should be shifting the emissions and energy use downward. And then we're also seeing a huge population growth at the same time, which is sort of eating up those efficiencies or those reductions. And so it's good for us to understand those. Then we move on to low carbon modeling. So once we have an idea of what the future may look like, then we can look at how can energy use and resulting emissions be augmented in the future to meet the target. So, how much do we need to reduce building emissions? How do we do that? Do we do it through retrofit programs? Do we do it through heat pumps? Do we do it through solar panels? And so we look at these different options and we try to find the optimal options again for your particular community. And we also, along with that low carbon modeling, do financial and economic modeling. So we understand how much it will cost to implement the low carbon pathway. I'm just going to give a disclaimer here that community energy and emissions plans, climate action plans, there are, they're a very interesting type of plan and document. Most of the time at the government level, the government is endorsing plans that they can fully implement within their powers, within their authority. And that isn't true of a climate action plan. So we're looking at, what needs to happen across the entire community. And then the county will take on a piece of the implementation. They have different roles where they can lead. There's places where they can certainly lead, doing retrofits in their own buildings, setting good policies. There are places where they can support, so they can educate the community. They can point you in the direction of incentives that are already there. They can develop programs and initiatives for the community. And then there's a role for the county to advocate. So for example, in Oregon, the county cannot set its own building code that goes above the state code. And so maybe there's an advocacy role there because, you know, at the county level, there is no power to say, you know, you'll build to a higher, more efficient standard. So we look at those pieces, you know, how much will it cost and what needs to be done, but also what role do different actors play in implementation. All right, so this is what it looks like. It's a very complex and very detailed model. I won't get into all the details, but basically, you know, we request data from the county, from other trusted sources. We get a lot from the census. We get a lot from the Federal Department of Energy. We set up our model. We develop that business as planned scenario and the low carbon scenario. And then from there, we look at, you know, what actions need to be taken in what order, and we do the financial analysis, and then we analyze the co-benefits. Alongside that, I mentioned it's an iterative and integrated process. So we are going through engagement at the same time as we're going through these modeling steps. So we get a sense right at the bat, typically on our projects, of you know, community needs and who we need to engage through pre-engagement interviews. We plan the engagement activities through setting objectives. What do we want to know from the community? How can they support decision making? Engagement's really a decision making support process. So what can we learn from the community that's going to help decision makers make their decision about this plan? And we develop the engagement strategy based on that. And then we go into this phase of active engagement, which we're in right now. We implement the engagement strategy, and that happens right up to the end of the project. And then in the final report, you will see an engagement summary in the final report and a presentation back to decision makers if they request it from us, to talk about how engagement was set, how it influenced the process, what they need to know or take into account when they're making their decisions, and why we may have framed things and made certain recommendations based on what we heard from the community. Overall, we have this planning hierarchy when it comes to community energy and emissions planning, climate action planning. With emissions, we're really trying to avoid activities that generate emissions or require energy whenever possible. We're not trying to send anybody back to the Stone Age. We're just trying to get rid of excess energy use, you know, the simple stuff, turning off your lights, etc. Same with reduce. We're reducing energy required by using less and avoiding wasted energy. We're replacing, so we're switching to renewable energy sources. And sorry, on the reduce part, I should have mentioned as well, all of our energy efficiency activities fall in there. So that's, you know, your building retrofits, replacement of windows, doors, adding insulation, upgrading to more efficient heating systems, and then you're going on to replacing. So you're switching to renewable energy sources. So that's adding your solar panels, getting away from coal and all of those pieces. And then you can remove, which is using natural systems or technology to sequester greenhouse gases. And then there's offsetting, investing in emissions reductions initiatives to decrease their costs and address local emissions that can't be eliminated for a lower cost. So a large part of our plans, we really play in the 2 and 3, you know, avoid is something that we can educate on and happen sort of like at an individual and personal level. The reduce and replace is where we work a lot, looking for those energy efficiency pieces and looking for the renewables. The reasons why we like to play in that space is because there are some really local benefits to playing in those spaces. You can, you know, create savings for people through efficiency. You can create jobs. You can get an economic return on a lot of these activities. The remove and offset, we tend to leave those to the end. There are some ways where, you know, you can see a local economic benefit from that, but sometimes it means paying money out to reduce or offset your emissions. That isn't going to kind of come back into the community or stay in the community. And so we try to work in those other spaces first. And so when we're developing the overall pathway, and I'm going to show you the start to that for Clackamas in a moment, we're really looking at it looks like this when we're talking about moving from where we are today to the target. So you'll see up in the top, I believe it'll be the left on your screen. It says we are here. So those are the emissions today. And this is just an example. And the dotted line along the top is, the expectation of how emissions will change over time. So imagine, the we are here being 2018, the right-hand side of your screen being 2050. So we move, in this fictitious community on this slide, their businesses, planned activities, the policies and programs they currently have in place are decreasing their emissions to a certain degree. But we're saying, they want to get to this target that's on that lower right-hand part of their screen. And so the programs and policies they have in place aren't going to cut it. They're not going to get all the way to that target. So we develop these actions. So building retrofits, transition to zero emission vehicles, land use maybe. And so each one of those colorful lines represents a different action. And so each one of them takes a chunk out of emissions. And you can see it's happening over time. So we have some actions that are starting right at the beginning of the scenario. Some are picking up later on. And that gray space underneath is still the carbon liability that still exists in the community or the carbon emissions. So that's what it looks like when we start putting these plans together and stacking actions. We're working to get to that outcome while still keeping it realistic for your community. And it looks like this. I've talked about a lot of this, but just to sort of, I guess, crystallize it, we start by exploring the local context, doing a lot of that reading, doing the pre-engagement, collecting data. Then we get into that baseline or inventory where we're looking at how energy is used today and where the emissions are coming from. If a target hasn't already been set for the community, we work with the decision makers and the community to set that target. At this, coming into Clackamas, the target was already set, so that's great. We already knew where we were headed. And then we start developing that low carbon pathway and doing the financial analysis. And then after that, we start looking at the implementation. How do you achieve that pathway in Clackamas County? What's the timeline for the different activities? And then, of course, like I mentioned, we offer that monitoring and evaluation framework. So that adaptive management can happen. You can track, where you've been and where you're going in your community. I also just want to highlight here that climate action plans, they address two parts of climate change. In this plan in particular, we're looking a lot at mitigation, so addressing the cause of climate change, the cause of emissions. So we're looking at buildings, transportation, waste, energy generation, etc. There's some overlap with adaptation. So adaptation is on the side of the climate is changing. We've got to slow it down. We've got to stop climate change. But we're in a position now across the globe where we are going to see impacts of climate change regardless. We've kind of pushed that envelope far enough. And so, how do we adapt to the impacts? And so a lot of our actions that we're working on in the mitigation space actually do have an impact on adaptation as well. So, building weatherization, adding that insulation, doors, windows, conserving water and energy, adding green infrastructure, so our tree planting and all that, and thinking carefully about land use, where we place buildings, etc. So there is some overlap there that we will address in this plan. So at this point, I'm going to pause briefly and have Kiana and Naomi let me know if there are any questions in the chat. I only have time to answer a couple of questions right now, but we will collect these and report back.
So I've been collecting them too. So if I haven't had a chance to get back to you in the chat, we'll come to them now. So Thomas asked, how is economic impact essentially calculated? Thomas might have been referring to the question in the game, but also just how are we sort of dealing with economic impact in the project? Did you want to address that at all, Brittany?
Yeah, so for our project, so we do economic modeling and it's in line with our low carbon modeling. And so we develop basically a sheet of financial assumptions that assumes the cost of the business's plan scenario and then the cost of the low carbon scenario. And so we use a lot of trusted sources. So we use the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We use Department of Energy data on expected costs of things like gasoline, diesel, electricity, etc. And we use all of those. Financials to build an economic analysis where, transportation is a great example. If we saw gasoline decreasing because we're getting away from gasoline vehicles and moving more towards electric vehicles, we would associate, we would slowly see the cost of or the money being spent on gasoline decreasing in the community, but the cost of the money being spent on electricity in the community increasing. And so there's some modeling that happens in the background to help us calculate that. Once we have our low carbon scenario in place, we do bring that forward to the county to check over our assumptions, and we get a sign off on that to make sure that we have the most local and relevant assumptions possible for Clackamas County.
Great, thank you. Aaron asks, what about shutting down airports? The carbon footprint of just one flight is unbelievably high, and this is the most effective and quickest thing that we can do. It's a good scoping question that we often get.
Yeah, so at this point, we do look at the emissions from airports within county boundaries. It's one of those pieces where the county does not have the authority to address those emissions directly. The county can't ban anybody from flying. It'd be really hard to just ban an airport, and if you did, it would just go somewhere else. And so that's often a role for advocacy. So we see that the airline transportation organization in the United States and across the world, they've made some commitments to reducing emissions. And so really the role there is advocacy and support for that to happen. But there is no direct control from the county's part.
Great, thank you. We've got some support for net zero building design for the new Clackamas County Courthouse expressed, and Bill says that the county can support, I think, the reduction of emissions. Let me know if I got that right, Bill, by encouraging forest growth with the trees sequestering carbon. Don't know if you wanted to comment on that at all, Brittany.
Yeah, that's a great one. Tree planting is a great thing. We often find when we end up calculating emissions reductions, it's not a huge emissions reductions, especially in the short term where we're looking at emissions reductions in a pretty tight time span now. But I would never discourage tree planting, and it has so many wonderful uses. Green infrastructure, it's really good on the adaptation side to help mitigate against things like flooding. It cools spaces, it offers shade, and there is, some component of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, just not a lot in the short term. So certainly encourage it, but certainly part of one of many things I would say on the tree planting front.
Great, thank you for that. Chuck says, if Clackamas County obtained zero emissions, what are the calculations that would show the exact effect on the atmospheric CO2 concentration? And what would all of this do to that? What is the atmospheric residence time for a CO2 molecule emitted? I think we can get...
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so let me answer that, and then after this, I will move on to the next part of the presentation, Naomi. So we can do something called basically a carbon budget, and so we do have an understanding of the sort of Clackamas's current portion of the global emissions right now, and sort of Clackamas's responsibility, if we can call it that, if we looked at the portion of emissions that Clackamas is responsible and should be responsible for decreasing over the amount of time. So I don't have those exact numbers with me today. It is something that I can figure out, but certainly, significant only if everybody participates. But again, like Kiana mentioned in our climate action plan, let us encourage that and not deter us and shift blame, because we all need to take action in every community. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks for
okay,
that.
I'm going to move on to the next part of the presentation.
Yeah, go for it. I was going to say thanks everyone to your questions so far. If we haven't come to them yet, we're still collecting them, so thank you for putting them in the chat. And if we don't get to answer them in all, like entirely in today's session, we will be submitting those answers, though, and you can find them on the project website.
Okay, I'm going to go through Clackamas County's greenhouse gas inventory baseline and businesses planned emissions, and then we're going to get back into an engagement activity. So just a little bit about what the baseline means. I've touched on this several times throughout the presentation, but it basically just allows the county, the community, to understand the nature of recent energy use and the resulting emission patterns and sources. So again, time-bound, spatial throughout the community. We get down to the traffic zone level, which is like a few blocks within the community. I'm going to put these in context in a moment here, but 49 million metric million British thermal units is the total community energy use, and that's about 118 MMBTUs per person. I'm going to show you what that looks like here in a moment. On the emissions side, 4.1 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, which is about 9.8 metric tons of CO2 equivalents per person. To stay within the 1.5 degree warming threshold that's being recommended sort of at the global level by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and has been, accepted by many countries in the world through the Paris Agreement and the Conference of Parties meetings. Basically, emissions should be 2.9 tons per person by 2030. So that's sort of the global standard. So right now, in the county, they're 9.8, just to give you sort of a scale there. And that doesn't include consumption-based emissions, which are, the emissions that come from, purchasing things and then being flown or shipped overseas. So let's put that in context with some charts here and talk about what we expect to see in Clackamas over the next 3 decades or so. So when we build these future scenarios going out to 2050, it's this internally consistent view of what the future might turn out to be. So it's not a forecast. I unfortunately cannot predict the future. I wish that I could sometimes I don't wish I could. But it's one possible future outcome that's based on currently available information. So it's plausible given the policies that exist, given the local practices that we've seen, legislation that's upcoming, but we can't fundamentally account for things like a COVID-19 pandemic happening and shutting down global travel and people working from home. We can't predict a war in Ukraine that's going to disrupt global fuel supplies and drive up costs. So a scenario is a scenario, but it doesn't tell us really about the volatility that we know happens in the real world. So I mentioned before, when we're quantifying the business's plan scenario, we collect data and information from the county, other trusted sources like the state, census. We look at the policies and plans that are approved and or underway. So we don't put anything in the business's plan scenario if somebody at the county tells us, oh, hey, yeah, we've been thinking about doing this. It'd be really great. And we might bring that to the board at some point. We don't put it in the business's plan scenario because there's no guarantee it's going to happen, regardless of how good of an idea it is, but we might consider it in the low carbon scenario. So we analyze and interpret the data and information that we receive to create the projections that you're about to see. So when it comes to energy use, you're seeing an overall increase in energy use in the county between 2018 and 2050. It's not a huge increase, but basically what you're seeing a decrease in energy being used for transportation, mostly due to the uptake of electric vehicles. So not only can they be run on renewable energy, but the motors are just more efficient than gasoline and diesel vehicles. So we do see a decrease in energy use there. We see some slight decreases in residential, commercial, industrial emissions. And so these are all in buildings. And so, we expect more efficient buildings to be built over time. We expect to see some retrofits without any additional programs being put in place, but we're also seeing population growth. And so, like I mentioned before, that sort of outstrips this efficiency gain that you get. When we look at that energy use by fuel type, we're seeing the largest portion being in gasoline, although that decreases over time as electric vehicles come online. And then you see sort of that subsequent increase in grid electricity. Natural gas increases a little bit as the population grows, but stays more or less the same. Diesel, same thing, stays more or less the same. And then we have some smaller sources of energy that are fairly consistent. When we look at emissions, we're seeing a nice dip in transportation during the pandemic, and then it recovers. And emissions decrease slightly when we move from gasoline vehicles to more electrification. Of note here is that the electricity grid is not completely renewable and clean at this point. So it doesn't mean that switching over to electric vehicles automatically means we get zero emission vehicles. And then we see some changes in building emissions over time. We see some decreases, the grid gets cleaner, etc. And so when we look at it by fuel type, you will see on the bottom is grid electricity. So we're seeing a good decrease in emissions from grid electricity. And so that happens mostly at the utility level. Some slight decreases again in gasoline. Natural gas stays fairly consistent. This is assuming that, there's no shift in the amount of people that are using natural gas in their homes and businesses or the amount they use. And then all of the other energy types are smaller and they're fairly consistent as well. Just to give you a visual here of the emissions per capita in the business as usual scenario, a business as planned scenario, we do expect to see a decrease from 9.8 metric tons per person in 2018 to 5.7 metric tons per person in 2050. So you're decreasing emissions by about a third, which is really great for a business as planned scenario. It's nice to see those emissions going down per capita over time. On an overall emissions perspective, they are still trending downward, mostly due to a decrease in grid emissions, but they're not going down as much as the per capita emissions. And again, this is due to population growth, more buildings, more cars, more people. And so, that pink star down there at the bottom, that's the target. So that's sort of the gap between where you would be in 2050 and where you want to be if you continue on sort of as is, right? So some positive things happening, but it doesn't meet the target.
Brittany, just a quick question, I think
Yes.
there. And is it the changes in population and employment that explain the dips in 2030? Just Bill was asking a question about that.
In 2030, I'll have to go back to the model for that. I know there's some like uneven things happening as the grid is shifting. And so we're seeing some of that sort of play out in sort of these dips, these peaks and valleys, because those are all happening in the grid electricity system. But I can confirm that by looking back at our data to see if there is any trend, population trend in there as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we also took a look for the county at what happens if we add in the consumption-based emissions. So this is, things being imported and used. And in that case, we would see emissions decrease overall, expecting that people are going to consume more stuff. So that gives us sort of a different trend to look at. And so that first chunk of emissions we looked at is the focus of most climate action plans. It's very important. But we want to signal as well, like this consumption piece cannot be ignored as well. It does impact emissions, it impacts emissions in other places of the world. So it is important to consider. Okay, so I am going to ask at this point if you have any additional questions about the business's planned modeling, and maybe I will just take 2 questions so we can move on to our engagement.
Okay, fantastic. So going back, there's a bunch of questions that came in during the presentation. One from Sean, is there a boost in emissions from adopting new tech that is included in greenhouse gas numbers? So for example, do I buy a newly manufactured electric vehicle, which has new emissions, of course, from construction, or continue to use my 5 to 10-year-old gas vehicle and just be mindful of my use?
Yeah, great question. So that would be a consumption-based emission. So that isn't in the sort of main part, but a very good question that we need to really ask ourselves as we're developing the low carbon scenario. What's better, what's worse?
Thank you. And then just to confirm, like, yeah, William, this is the data based on business as usual, or was that business as
Business as planned?
Thank
Yes.
you. Business is planned without climate mitigation. So the project is about significant, emissions reduction. So we're showing the size of the challenge if the county were not going to take climate mitigation. Then we're going to get into what it starts to look like getting there.
Exactly.
So those cover the 2 questions for now. We've got some more in the chat, but we're collecting those, so we'll get to those when we can.
Thank you. I'm just going to take 2 minutes here and wrap up, and we will move over to engagement. So basically, seeing where the emissions come from, we've really start to identify with the county the places, the sectors that need to be addressed, and it's really existing buildings, new buildings. So existing buildings, there's a lot of emissions in existing buildings because, we heat and cool them, we use electricity in them, so we need them to be as efficient as possible. We need them to be running on renewable sources. New buildings are incredibly long-lasting assets. So the last thing we want to do is to be building buildings that are going to last 50 plus years that our emission sources when we're trying to get rid of our emissions by 2050 before the end of the life cycle of those buildings, right? So we need to be mindful of that. Energy generation. So, is it renewable or is it not? We talk a lot about, what's the role of electrification versus the role of, let's say, technologies like renewable natural gas. Transportation, so that includes things like zero emission vehicles, transportation, active transportation, what's the right mix and balance for this particular community, and then decreasing emissions from waste. And so at this point, we see some opportunities and challenges starting to emerge, and we're still working with the county to finalize the actions and with some stakeholders before we get to the how piece. So in existing buildings, we see opportunities around the incentives and rebates that currently exist. There's quite a few available in Oregon and Clackamas County, but there is a patchwork of incentives and rebates for people to navigate. So that is a challenge, understanding how you access all those pieces, how they stack. There's an equity component here based on income, homeowners versus renters. What does it mean depending on whether you rent or own, and the scale of the retrofits required? We're going to need to see a lot of retrofits to meaningfully decrease emissions. With new buildings, again, those incentives are there. There's a REACH code that municipalities, cities can adopt, but not the county. And so that's both a benefit and a challenge. We need some education. This is across the board, not just in Clackamas County, on costs and benefits of building net zero or more efficient builds. And again, there's that patchwork of incentives and rebates to navigate. For energy generation, the Oregon House Bill 2021 was passed. And so that is for electricity to be renewable, all electricity in the state to be emissions free by 2040. So that's fantastic. And so we're trying to understand a little bit more about what that means and how it's all going to play out, but it's a very good thing. There's already the ability to purchase carbon-free electricity from Portland General Electric, and some residents and businesses are already doing so. So that's a fantastic first step. And again, scale of the challenge, navigating all those programs, and then addressing equity. It does cost at this point to buy into that program with PGE. On the transportation side, there's a federal EV target, electric vehicle target. So the federal government has set a target for more electric vehicles to be replacing gasoline and diesel vehicles over the next 15 years. So that's great. The county has been talking about intensification targets in urban areas, so seeing most of the growth in urban areas. And so that helps with our active transportation and transit use. There's updates to the transportation and active transportation plans that are happening right now. And so there's opportunities there to think about emissions. Again, the scale of the challenge here is huge. Behavior changes required. So the county can't drag people out of their cars or force them to buy a certain type of car. And so there is, it's really about change management and people's individual behavior on the transportation front. Connecting rural and urban areas is a challenge in Clackamas. So they're both rural and urban areas. So understanding the transportation network and people's needs. And again, that comes to an equity piece as well. On the waste side, we see a pay-as-you-throw system already exists. So people pay for waste. There's a move towards extended producer responsibility in the state. And that means, the producers of waste, the manufacturers will be paying for more of those recycling programs and options. The challenge is the system isn't consistent across the county at this point. There's some privatization of the system, and that can make it challenging to get everybody on the same page. Hopefully EPR helps with that. And the opportunities for composting are limited in some areas. So our next steps really are to move along this trajectory, finalize those actions. So the actions really I'm going to show you here are they're the what, they're the physical reality and changes that are required to meet that target. So they're your building retrofits, it's the replacement of transportation options with lower emissions options. And it's what we can model. We can model that change in the physical reality. And then we need to think about the how. And that's the part where we really need your engagement and input. So what are the education programs, policies, initiatives, and investments that are going to help the community along on this journey? How do we achieve that reality of building retrofits and transportation changes in Clackamas County? And so that's really important for us to understand because we do want to reflect the local context and what's going on and what's going to be achievable in your community. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Kiana and Naomi to run our engagement session. And keep the questions coming in the chat, please. We will get to them, if not during the session, then after.
That's great. Thanks very much, Brittany. So we've taken you through a lot of information, and so we want to get your feedback a few ways. So we're going to go back into Mentimeter. And Kiana, do you want to walk us through that, please?
Yep. So again, to join Mentimeter, there's the instructions at the top, then that purple bar. So you go to www.menti.com, and then you enter that code that you see up there. So 46522180. Another way is also to join through the link that was also shared in the Zoom link, our Zoom chat, which I'll share very shortly. I'll just wait for folks to join in if you haven't joined us already. Yet. But Brittany, when you're ready to go, you can. There's that link as well. So if you click that link, it's also in the Zoom chat. That'll send you directly to this Menti. And so for those who are already logged into Menti, there should be a text box option for you to go ahead and type your answers to this question, which is, are there any burning ideas for decreasing emissions in Clackamas County? So I think there's a few mentioned in the Zoom chat, but again, you can also mention it here as well. So I give folks a moment to that.
Great, more EV charging stations. More regular and accessible public transportation. EVs are great, yep. But there's the role of buses and trains. Lots of banning, so just straight up going to the ban sort of option, sort of in there. Thank you for that. Yeah, reducing demand for energy in general, like regardless of source. That's an important one. We talk a lot about energy efficiency over here, lots of discussion about energy efficiency, but reducing demand is also an important part of the conversation. Yeah, major increase in home and commercial retrofits. Yeah, improvements to bus service. Lowering barriers to like fares, sort of seeing that too. Yeah, behavior change is a lift for sure. Transportation on demand for the rural elderly. There was a comment in the chat too about you know, the difference too in terms of patterns between urbanites and rural dwellers too, which we, the model does account for things like that. I don't know, Brittany, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think especially when we're working in a space where there's urban areas and rural areas, we have looked at the mode shift being different now between people living in urban areas and rural areas, and that continuing even in a low carbon scenario. We know that there has to be a shift in all of the mode shares. So the type of transportation people are using is what I mean by mode share. So bike, walk, active transportation, carpooling, individual vehicle trips. But they will always be different between the urban areas and rural areas.
Thanks for that. All right, we'll spend another few seconds on this, then we'll move to the next question. Thanks very much, Eben, for jumping in on that question about waste in the chat. Transit, more solar on rooftops, yeah, wonderful. Food consumption suggestions too, and growing of food. Protecting old growth forests in Clackamas County to continue with sequestration.
Awesome.
Great.
I will move us along.
Okay. So what barriers do you face in taking climate action? Thinking of the suggestions that you've already given us and also the information that's been presented in terms of the size of the challenge. Yeah, what barriers are out there?
Right. We're hearing a lot about transit at this point in the last question, and our first answer here is getting transit service to suburban areas. Climate denial. My neighborhood is still not conducive to choices like walking, biking, or transit. So another concern around or challenge around the transportation system. Cost. Retrofit is expensive. It is. And I hope that at the end of this project, we can help identify some of the things that are already out there and identify new pathways. Energy retrofits are complicated and can be expensive upfront. Yeah, great point. It's not just the cost. It's where do you get started? Who do you hire? Do you do it yourself? There's all those questions. Cost and reliability. Travel alternatives are difficult in topographically constrained areas. Biking up a hill is hard. Yes, I live in a river valley, so I hear you on that one. Understanding the indirect impacts of climate action plan actions like solar and wind need batteries and more transmission. Okay, yep. Unsafe bike lanes on public streets are a deterrent for me. We will spend a couple more seconds here, Naomi.
Yeah.
Good.
Thanks very much, everybody, for these. It's good to hear.
Our politics do not include youth. Am I getting that whole thing? Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. I'll move on to the next question here.
Okay, Kiana, did you want to walk us through this question?
Yep. So this question is asking, based on what your options here, what is your biggest daily concern? So we're just asking you to rank from 1 to 6. So 1 being your main top highest concern to number 6 being your least concern. And as we're inputting that information, what Menti will do, will take the average and display it here.
Exactly. So your individual answers won't be known to us or who put them in for any of these really, but with this ranking as well. This really helps us as climate action planners. We think about climate action all the time, every day. And so it's hard for us to sometimes gauge where it sits on people's priorities. And that's not a judgment. We all have things in our daily lives that we need to focus on and different needs. And so it's good to see, where people can kind of have the capacity to think about climate change with the other things that are going on in their daily lives. And it also helps us think about the co-benefits. Can we address climate action while at the same time addressing things like health and well-being in a community, affordability? So these are really important things that help us understand your community a little bit better.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, everybody, for this. All right, shall we move on to the next question?
Okay. I think this is a follow-up here. If anybody wants to quickly just drop in any other daily concerns not mentioned before, is there anything we're missing that we haven't identified that maybe a top concern that maybe can be a co-benefit or something through the climate action plan, or maybe is a daily concern that you face that kind of takes up your time and energy that doesn't allow you to focus on things like climate change. Provide a few more seconds here in case anybody has anything left they want to say here.
Kids education, yeah. Involvement of youth in political dialogue, yeah.
The economy, yeah.
Yeah, the use of throughput and resources to create batteries and things like that are needed for new tech. Kids, yeah.
The world problems, yeah. There's a lot going on in the world these days.
Yeah. There sure is. Okay. Thanks very much, everyone, for these. Let's go to the next question. What challenges do we need to be aware of to be successful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Clackamas County? This is where your local knowledge too becomes really helpful to us.
Mm-hmm. So it could be, I know people have identified things like active transportation infrastructure. Could also talk about these here. Maybe it's a coal lobby we don't know about. Anything like that you're aware of that you feel is stopping or maybe hindering progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, it could be political, it could be social, it could be just about anything physical. Maybe there's no space. I don't think that's the case in Clackamas County, but we've definitely worked in very urban environments where there is very little space for some of the renewable energy infrastructure. Housing is so expensive and supply isn't keeping up with demand. Yeah, that's significant. The county has urban, suburban, exurban, and rural areas, all of which have different needs and resources. One size fits all doesn't work for us. Yeah, that's a great point. What works for people in the city and for urban environments does not necessarily work for those other environments. Commissioners and department heads recognizing climate change is real, so some political pieces there. Well, we need to reduce how many dogs and cats we have. We really like our pets. That's interesting. We hear about that every once in a while, about the energy that's consumed from our pets. Love my pets too. So All right, we'll spend just another minute here. Lack of understanding of the benefits of action.
Do pets consume energy? Yeah, comment on this concept, please. There's energy sort of consumption related to the purchase of goods and services, including those things that you would use to help your pets. And yeah, it depends too, I guess, if you were to use what type of transportation you might use to take pets who require walks, on walks. There's multiple ways to kind of think about it. The energy consumed to produce their food. They're part of the system, I guess, as well, as one way of thinking about it. Brittany, did you want to expand on that at all?
I think most of it would fall into those consumption-based emissions, like you mentioned, Naomi, with things like food and products that you use for your pets. Labor shortages, lack of informed people, getting programs to expand to rural areas is difficult. People in those areas are often reliant on fossil fuels and politically conditioned not to worry about climate change. A lot of diversity and balance overall. Those are really good points.
Sean,
right, thank you for.
Sean mentioned something in the chat. Sean, do you have an article on that, or is it just something I wonder if you've heard people say? A large dog produces as much greenhouse gas as an SUV. I guess it depends on the SUV too, but yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to move on to the next question that here. I know we're getting short on time, and we want to make sure that we get all these in. So how can Clackamas County, how can the county itself support you in reducing your greenhouse gas emissions? How do you feel the county can support you? Shuttle circulators in the absence of standard buses. Tax breaks for retrofits. We can't get the meaningful support we need as long as Tootie is the county chair. She needs to be removed from office. There's some political underpinnings kind of coming through here again, people's opinions on that. The county needs to mount a public awareness campaign and also pass needed ordinances for changing our CO2 situation. We'll let this one go for one more minute here. Continue to work with the city partners to provide financial incentives for desired behavior outcomes. Ban backyard burning. So again, going back to ordinances. Food and housing security. If we help people's most basic needs, we create freedom of choice elsewhere in the system. It's a great point. Okay, recognizing we're getting to the end of our time here, I am going to move on. So I'm going to move on to this last question here. Is there anything else you would like to share today? And I'm going to leave that open here while we close up. So I want to let you know we are going to continue to work on the next steps of the climate action plan with county staff. We'll be finalizing low carbon actions, and we're going to be doing another presentation just like this one on Thursday. We're going to be working with focused groups and facilitated discussions to get more public engagement. We continue to work with a community task force on developing actions and implementation mechanisms. And so we're going to keep the work moving. There's a website I'm going to show you here in a moment, and maybe somebody can put it in the chat for me, where you can learn more about the project, learn more about upcoming engagement opportunities. So at this point, I want to say thank you very much for joining us today and for taking the time to provide your insights and your feedback. We're going to take a look at all of it. And also we'll look at the questions in the chat that we weren't able to answer today to see if we can get some answers to you. And at this point, I'm just going to turn it back over to the county to close up for today. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Kiana. Thank you, Naomi, for facilitating our conversation today. I appreciated the opportunity to listen in. We want to thank everyone in our community who's able to join today for taking the time out of your busy schedules. We do not take it for granted, and we appreciate that you're here. And also, in closing, there's another opportunity for engagement on this project. If you go to the link below, you'll see, I think right now on your screen, clackamas.us/sustainability/climate action. You can learn more about the project, and especially we would love it if you would complete the climate action plan survey that's located there, which is available in both English and Spanish. If you want to be added to the project's email list, send an email to climate@clackamas.us and we'll add you to our interested parties list as well. So again, thank you so much for being here. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.